Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and today I'll be building this Carro Armato, which translates as armed wagon or armed vehicle from Italian. This Italeri and Warlord kit can also be built as a semivente or self-propelled artillery, but I'll be building it as the M14/41 Carro Armato light tank. In the box is all the usual bolt-action vehicle accessories. This one was packed by Rhodesia, thank you. We have a transfer sheet that mostly has Australian markings, and then some German markings, with the Italian ones tucked away in the corner, which is a little bit of a shame. There are also cards for the Semivente DA75/18 and Carro Armato M13/14, which is great, but I'll be building the M14/41, which doesn't have a card here. I think there are 6 different variants of tank that you can build out of this box, so expecting every single one to have a card is a little much. Certainly the 1340 and the 1441 are very similar. We also have the instruction booklet, which I have to say is a big improvement over previous kit's instructions from Italeri. There are more steps shown, and that means that each step isn't a scramble of many parts, and it seems like the viewing angle is often better positioned. It's also in colour as well, and so you get some examples of painted vehicles, although one thing that I notice, whilst there is a list of the sprue parts, there isn't one for the transfer sheet, and whilst that would be a nice addition to help those of us who are new to historical models, or haven't necessarily researched the markings of a particular vehicle, it's a quite small point, and I wouldn't necessarily call that a complaint, as nobody else seems to do this either. The 2 sprues are pretty well moulded. There are some mould lines of course in certain places, but nothing that a quick scrape with the back of a knife can't fix. The first has mostly all of the small bits, and the second has the armour panels, suspension assemblies, and the larger bits. To get started, as is usual for Italeri tanks, the suspension and road wheels are all moulded together on a backing panel. We get a second piece for the drive sprocket, which fits in nice and tight on its keying, and the back idler wheel, which the Carro Armato is out on this tiny little spindly stem that seems quite breakable. The track links themselves then go on as a lower piece, top piece, and the smaller front and rear. The longer sections have tabs that hold them nicely into place, and if you take advantage of the over-moulded road wheels, you have a lot of surface area for glue. Oddly, I found that the front and rear have the same numbering, which did cause a headache for a lot of folks with the M3 Stuart kit. But here, the rear part is actually interchangeable. The front part is sort of reversible in a way. The sprue has 61A and 61B marked, so you can put them on the correct side, but I'm pretty sure I put them on the wrong sides, and yet they still managed to fit. This type of track building is plenty enough for wargaming in terms of detail, and once your polycement is set, is nice and durable. It can be a little fiddly to get things into place when the tracks are this thin especially, just keep prodding them back into place until the cement is set. With the tracks set aside to dry, the rear part of the hull comes next, and a tiny, I think it's a towing point, and this goes onto the back of the hull tub piece and will line up with the idler wheels on the tracks. Usually for Italeri tanks I keep the track pieces separate for painting, but I thought that I could keep the track guards separate on this particular tank. Turns out that's not correct, but I'll talk about that later. And so what I did at this step is to glue all of the track pieces onto the hull, and that did actually help lining up that rear piece for the idler wheels. The front of the hull has this rounded piece which goes on with the rivets towards the top and sits very nicely in place. The second piece goes on flat with hatches to the front, but this piece can slide side to side, so it's best to keep this lined up with the first piece until that's set. The front also has some tiny little details, towing hooks or something. The loop goes into the middle slot, and the hooks on the sides point upwards. You do have to really clean the sprue connections point quite well for these, otherwise they won't fit, as the slots for them are pretty tight. Returning our attention to the back of the hull, there are some accessories to go on. The instructions say to remove a peg for the later M14/41 that I'm building, but I wasn't necessarily 100% convinced which peg I should be removing, and in the end I cut off both the left peg on the rear hull and the one off of the fuel filling point looking thing. The right side was far more simple, as it's a spare set of road wheels, which does go to show that the moulded road wheels on the tracks are quite inaccurate on these kits, and some people complain about this. I personally don't really mind. There is then also this handle bloop thing, which doesn't seem to have a good place to go. There's no keying for it, and the surface texture below doesn't really match. Hopefully I've got it on close enough that it'll look right. Now, here is the point where I thought I could sub-assemble. The track guard pieces slot nicely into these little slots and clip over the tracks very securely. However, in later steps, mainly the upper hull, these do actually need to be glued into place first, making it much more difficult to do without sub-assembling in a lot of parts, and I don't like to do a lot of parts when sub-assembling. The upper hull at the back of the tank starts with this kind of cornered piece, and it fits very nicely in the corner, but it does slide side to side, so again, make sure that keeps in line as the cement is setting. The track guard then gets a storage box, and an exhaust goes on the hull side, and at this point I was still trying to keep the track guard sub-assembled, so I'm only gluing where it absolutely has to be, but really these should be glued much more securely. And the exhaust actually should be suspended slightly and not directly touching the track guard. On the top goes some vent filters, and there are different variants for different time periods. I'm going for the later version. There is then this little detail in the middle, which I'm not sure is a fuel filler cap or a radiator or a siren. I don't know what half these bits are. I'm not an expert on Italian tanks. This is my first. The last of the rear hull details are some tools, and there's two pieces that stack up to make this little collection that actually looks pretty cool. I think I visually prefer this to them being scattered around like you see on most tanks, which is probably more practical. Now we can build the upper hull proper, which is where the Semavente and Carro Armato differ the most. If you want, you can build the interior and paint that up for the Semavente and leave the hatches open so that it's visible. But for the Carro Armato, it's never visible, and so those are spare parts for the bits box. The Carro Armato upper hull goes together fairly well. The keying is all very small, so it's hard to see on my video here, and the instructions do have a nice upside down view so that you can get it all together correctly. But the sides, rear and front go together on the top quite well, and the front has a double machine gun mount, which sadly isn't a separate piece, so it can't be moved, but it's perfectly fine pointing straight forwards. This whole upper hull assembly can now glue down onto the main hull, and the track guards fixing those in place. I realised, and at this point I glued down the track guards to make sure that it was all nice and secure. I'll just have to reach in with a brush for those tracks when I get to it, no big deal. We're not done with the hull just yet. We have some steps that go onto both sides so that your tiny crew can climb in more easily. And then there is this absolutely tiny something or other that goes on top, and it is just small enough that it's not going to interfere with the turret's movement later. And we have a pair of headlights that go onto the front corners. Finally, we can move on to the turret, and as I'm making the later variant, there's an extra plate that fits on top that needs these little holes drilled open. You don't need exactly the right drill bit, so long as you cut between each of the holes. This area will be covered by the extra panel. Just check the panel to see where that goes and you can cut accordingly. At first I drilled my holes too small and so the panel didn't fit, and then I expanded them to be too big and so it kind of shifted around, but I nudged it and kept it lined up for the cement to set. For the turret, we can now assemble the armor panels against either the top or bottom piece, as they all kind of fit together and line up exactly. They only go in the correct space, so the rounded rear pieces and angled front pieces have to go on the correct left and right sides. The front armor piece is for mounting the light anti-tank gun, which has a little trunnion that the gun fits into, and an odd mounting piece that I think is supposed to let the gun elevate and depress without gluing it in a fixed position. This actually seems to be a very similar design to the one on the Panzer III that I made a little while ago, and there just isn't enough surface area for the mounting piece to glue in place without it also sticking the trunnion. And so I cemented over the whole thing, kept it solidly fixed in place. When I put this on the turret, I made sure that the gun was fairly flat, as that's a sensible position for it to be in. Finally, I put the turret roof on, or for you this might be the turret base if you're building it the other way up, and we just have to do the last interesting bits for the turret. The commander is a torso with a separate head, and there are 2 heads to choose from, and then his hatches can go into place. If you prefer, you can put the hatches closed and not have the crew visible, but I like to have the commander at least poking out, as it gives the opportunity for some different paints to make the whole model a little more varied. The last is the optional anti-air machine gun, which I usually don't take in game terms, but I often put them on the models so that I at least have the option to do, and just because it looks cool. And that means that I now have a model Carro Armato M14/41 tank built up for my slowly growing Italian forces. Let me know in the comments your thoughts, and do check in next week where I'll paint up this light tank. I'd also like to quickly mention all of the spare parts that comes with this kit for the other variant. As I built it as a light tank, all of the parts for the self-propelled artillery, the sub-assemblies, are spare, and they are actually coherent enough to build the whole casemate with all of the internals and gun mount. And so I'll probably make these up, and either I'll kitbash a vehicle to go on, or I can put them as a gun in placement with some mud texture around it. The second crewman is also for the sub-assemblies, and this time is a full body, so I actually painted him up as a separate artillery observer or officer's assistant. If you'd like to see me paint that, it is in my very political video from a little while back. But this video is about the M14/41 Carro Armato, and that is done, so the video can end. I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.